This module is your introduction to the idea of American mass culture. In 1900, when the 20th century began, there were towns, there were provinces, there were states, there were nationalities, there were parishes, but there was not a mass American culture, the likes of which was created by the national media and by the national entertainment and by the creation of advertising and national tastes. So this is what we'll explore. Images and trends that came and went. American mass culture. Everybody tends to have a preference in toothpaste. Either you're a Colgate guy or you're a Crest gal, or you just buy the cheapest brand available. You've got favorite movies, favorite superheroes, clothes, shoes, brands of beer, television programs. All of these together created a series of cultural icons that are the foundation for our American mass culture. Americans no longer in this 21st century collect green stamps. These are the little Sperry and Hutchinson green stamps that we used to get. We'd go to a retailer, and if you spent $10, you might get 10 green stamps. You'd put them in a little book. You'd save them up. You'd fill up 1 book, 2 books, 3 books. You'd go to a redemption center, and you'd present 4, 5, 8 books, and you'd walk up and down, and no money exchanged hands here. What you did is you traded in your green stamp books, where you collected all of these, and you'd get something for free. Well, it wasn't anything for free. It was developing loyalty. These were the first customer loyalty programs. People collected green stamps, top value stamps, Eagle stamps in St. Louis, but that's the whole idea. Nobody resold shoes anymore. Americans go out because they're made in foreign countries. There are, with the exception of some very high-end designer brands, no shoes made in America anymore. They're made all over the world. St. Louis, my hometown, was the center for shoe manufacturing in America. There are no such centers anymore. People used to repair televisions, now they throw them away. A lot of people used to sew their own clothes until the middle of the 20th century. Now they buy them off the rack. One of the things I regret the most is that I don't think your generation really understands what it is to eat a leisurely dinner. For you, food is basically a refueling stop. I used to go with my brother and my mother and my father up to my Uncle Nick's house. He was the patriarch of the family, the brother of my dad's father. And he was the relative we had there with his wife and his in-laws. We would sit there, even when we were very young boys, and have Sunday dinner that lasted 3 hours. And we'd have conversation, and we'd have one course, we'd have soup, we'd have the chicken, we'd have the ham, and it was in itself an event. We weren't refueling to race on someplace else. The dinner itself was an event. I submit to you that's part of what was lost in the 20th century. Now, for those of you who are in the know, you will understand that Al Jolson was the world's greatest entertainer in the 20th century. Oh, sure, Elvis Presley had some press and, was in the album sale business for a while. But Al Jolson was the world's greatest. He was a guy who came from Washington, D.C. His father was a rabbi, and he was at the edge of every one of the great entertainment advances in that century. He moved from vaudeville into Broadway. He was in the movies. He was the star of The Jazz Singer, the first recognized talking picture in 1928. Go to YouTube and watch a little. Well, if we're in class together, I'll show you some Al Jolson, and you'll understand why he was the world's greatest entertainer. Other elements of became cultural icons were cigarettes. I mean, people clearly smoked. It was a social thing to do. Women smoked, men smoked, you smoked brands. It created the consumer society because we were always out buying another pack of cigarettes. I never was a smoker, but people did. The Ford Model T, Bakelite. Bakelite was a plastic, a moldable plastic that you may now know as billiard balls. That's about how hard it was. It was an amazing, amazing material, and it gave us the ability to create all kinds of products. Automats were restaurants where you actually, I'll show you a picture in class, where you actually put coins in, you opened a little door, the hatch opened, and behind this big display of all these little food items was a full kitchen. And it could be refrigerated, it could be hot. They were all the thing. Elvis Presley, Gary Cooper, Hedy Lamarr, some of the great entertainers, and of course that Ford sports car called the Mustang. Now it's hard to believe, but at the beginning of the 20th century, no more than about 10% of all the 18-year-olds had graduated from high school. My mother's father actually was remarkable that way. He was among this 10% who had graduated from high school. This is a picture of my dad at his high school graduation in 1935. He was the first in his family to go past 6th grade. He went on, of course, graduated from law school. By the time the century ended, high school graduation was more of a phenomenon. 83% whites, blacks, and Hispanics, as the numbers show here. This was a trend that came about in the 20th century. This is a trend that has continued into the 21st century. It's hard to imagine there was a time when people did not have at least this foundational education, but at the beginning of the 20th century, they did not. In the same way, the college degree movement came about. By the time the century ended, about 25% held college degrees, baccalaureate degrees. It is about the same now, maybe decreasing a little bit. In 1910, only 3% did, and those 3% tended to be the doctors and the lawyers and the bankers, tended to be absolutely the economic elite in America. So this became more of a middle-class phenomenon. And as I mentioned a couple of days ago, the GI Bill gave people, the guys who returned from World War II, a chance to get their college degree, and then it was a greater expectation for them to provide such opportunities for their children. This is, I think this is pretty amazing when you consider how far we have come as a nation toward advancing our education. Now, one of the great trends in the 20th century was women going to work. Here it says in 1900 only about 6% of clerical jobs were held by women. What people don't realize is if you were a secretary in the early part of the 20th century, you were a man, because operating a typewriter was very much of a mechanical task that required strength. And it wasn't until typewriters got better designed and women learned shorthand that they began to get in the workplace. So the best estimates are that about 18% of American women worked outside the house. Just 18%. And most of those were cleaning women and cooks and those kinds of people. By 1969, about 43% of the workforce was women. By 1999, about 60% working outside the house were women. In 1970, it's amazing that fewer than 10% of the persons earning law degrees and medical degrees were women. By the time this century ended, it had climbed to a half. I have a friend of mine who was a legislator in the Kansas legislature back in 1970s, and he describes a story in his first term when they were debating on the floor of the House of the Kansas House of Representatives whether or not women should be admitted to medical school at University of Kansas. Why should they be? They're just going to get the degree and then go home and get pregnant and never work as doctors. That was thinking as recently as a few years ago in my lifetime in the 1970s. Times have changed, and women are at work. Women are at work for different reasons now, too. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. We talk about wealth and income disparity in America. Now, in the early days, that is in the 19th century, if you wanted to smoke, you had to roll your own. Now, some of you may be familiar with that phenomenon of buying cigarette paper and putting the tobacco in there and rolling your own cigarettes. Well, people did it. People like to smoke. People like to chew. They like to use tobacco in all kinds of ways. But late in the 19th century, machine-made cigarettes started operating out of the factories. And then cigarettes were advertised. But the really big push came when the cigarette companies put cigarettes, free cigarettes, in the rations, that is the little meal kits that soldiers got. World War I, World War II. These guys had nothing to do with their time but sit around and wait. So they picked up the habit of smoking. And of course, Congress banned cigarette advertising in 1970, required the warning label, and now fewer and fewer people in this 21st century smoke. And that's a good thing. I have to tell you, when I would go to the St. Louis Hawks basketball game, the professional team, back in the 60s, at Kiel Auditorium, it was one great big smoky fog in the whole room. The only place that you could see is you could see the brightly lighted basketball court down in front of you. If you can only imagine what that must have been like. Speaking of cigarettes, celebrities, Barbara Stanwyck, Ronald Reagan, they recognized that cigarettes were an opportunity for them to add their voice and get a check for talking about advertising. 7,000 medical articles were reviewed by the Surgeon General. The Surgeon General finally decided, you know what? Lung disease, heart disease, all kinds of conditions. It's interesting to look at some of these advertisements from the 40s and 50s. You talk about Lucky Strikes, your throat protection against irritation, against cough. Of course you're getting smoker's cough if you're smoking cigarettes. And then of course, Ronald Reagan, the actor, who was starring at the time in Hong Kong, a film, was promoting Chesterfields as an ideal Christmas gift. All packaged up, and sure, we gave cigarettes as gifts in those days. I didn't, but people did. So you get a little more idea of how pervasive cigarettes were. Now, in 1930, American artist Grant Wood created American Gothic. American Gothic is this famous picture, a very literal picture of a farmer and his wife. Actually, it was Grant Wood's sister and his dentist from the local town in Iowa. And they represented sort of what America looked like in rural circumstances, the plain, unvarnished look of America at the heart of America in Iowa. Gordon Parks was a very famous photographer, and he created this photograph in 1942 of this cleaning woman in Washington, D.C., who's standing there with her broom and her mop in front of the American flag in this federal building where she worked. Gordon Parks was making his own commentary. This cleaning woman, these are the ordinary faces of America these days. It's not just the white faces out in Iowa who were the farmers at the turn of the century. It's these people who we don't see because they clean the buildings at night. It's these people whom many of us walk past in the city because we don't recognize what they do or how important their work is to us. This is an interpretation of American Gothic by Gordon Parks. Racial discrimination was not invented in the 20th century, but it hit its high marks when you saw the Supreme Court come as it did in 1954, arguing that separate but equal was not sufficient. This is Elizabeth Eckford, the young black woman in the center. She was among 9 black children who were going to Central High to integrate it that September day in Little Rock. Hazel Bryan was the young woman behind her who was saying unkind things. And this is an iconic photo taken by Mr. Counts, who was a photographer for the Arkansas Democrat at the time. This picture summarizes, not only does it have Hazel Bryan's enmity toward Elizabeth Eckford, it has Elizabeth Eckford's calm resolve, her firm intent to walk on. And then if you look at some of the young men behind Elizabeth, you can see amusement or indifference. And all of those photos, all of those people in the photo exemplify what discrimination was like. Now, as I was preparing for this class, I found out that there was a book entitled Elizabeth and Hazel. And so I just read it over the summer. It's a wonderful book written by this guy who examined their lives and their brief reconciliation they had in the 1990s. And the lesson that I got out of the book was racial discrimination diminishes she who is hated and she who hates. Both of these women had terrible adventures in their lives that resulted from the discrimination that one gave and the other felt. Hazel Bryan tried as she could to compensate later in her life, and she did many good works, but in the end she seemed to eventually come down on the side that the races were different and not nearly the same. Elizabeth Eckford lived a remarkable life, telling her story, telling it often. I encourage you to read this book. It is a remarkable chapter out of America. And the terrible thing about it is Governor Orville Faubus was not cooperating, and President Eisenhower had to finally send federal troops in. He sent the 101st Airborne to escort Elizabeth and the other 8 children into Central High that day. The irony is that Hazel Bryan's parents were so upset that they pulled her out of Central High and she went to another nearby high school.